Keep a tight perimeter.
At this exact moment, as you listen to these words, a Russian frigate is equipped with a missile that the U.S. Navy's most advanced defense system cannot reliably intercept. This isn't speculation. This isn't science fiction. This is the operational reality of 2023. The missile's name is the 3M22 Zircon, and the number that will define everything you're about to understand today is 45 seconds. 45 seconds. That is the amount of time an American destroyer's Aegis system has to detect, classify, track, and launch an interceptor against an incoming Zircon. Not 45 seconds to do one of those things. 45 seconds to do all of them, in sequence, without error, against an object traveling at Mach 8 speeds, nearly 10,000 kilometers per hour. What you are going to see in this video will change how you view American naval defense. Because 45 seconds, once you grasp what needs to happen within that window, is not enough time. The math doesn't lie. Today, you will understand why the Zircon has created a vulnerability that no software update can fix. Why Aegis, one of the most sophisticated combat systems ever built, was designed for a completely different threat, and why the gap between what the US has today and what it needs is real, measurable in time, and directly impacts where American aircraft carriers can operate. Let's start the clock. An Arleigh Burke-class destroyer is on patrol in the Norwegian Sea. The Combat Information Center is active. Operators are monitoring the displays. The SPY-1, the Aegis electronic scanning radar, is steering its beams electronically, sweeping the airspace around the ship. Aboard the frigate Admiral Gorshkov, 500 kilometers away, a Zircon is launched. In the first few seconds, the missile accelerates. It climbs to a high-altitude cruising profile where the thin air offers less resistance. At a speed between Mach 8 and Mach 9, it covers 100 kilometers in under 40 seconds. Now imagine what needs to happen aboard the American destroyer in those 45 seconds. First, the SPY-1 must detect the missile's radar return. This isn't automatic. The radar needs to get a return strong enough to distinguish itself from background noise. Second, the combat system must classify the contact. Is it a missile? What type? Is it a threat? Third, the fire control system must establish a tracking solution, a projection of where the target is going to be, not where it currently is. Fourth, the operator or the automated system must make the engagement decision and launch an interceptor. Fifth, the interceptor must be guided into a collision course with a target moving faster than anything Aegis was originally designed to stop. All of this. 45 seconds. The clock doesn't stop for you to think. It doesn't stop for you to double-check. It doesn't stop if the first interceptor misses. That is the problem this video will prove. Not as a mere claim, but as a direct consequence of physics and system architecture. Once you understand the full sequence, the number 45 will stop seeming dramatic and will start feeling like what it truly is, a sentence. To understand why 45 seconds is not enough time, you first need to understand what the Zircon is, not as a Russian propaganda slogan, but as a physical object with documented properties that create real-world consequences. The 3M22 Zircon, also transliterated as Zircon, is a hypersonic cruise missile. Its development began in the Soviet era as a successor to supersonic anti-ship missiles like the P-700 Granite. What the Russians achieved with the Zircon is a fusion. The speed and trajectory of a ballistic missile in its terminal phase combined with the maneuverability of a cruise missile. Its operational speed is Mach 8 to Mach 9. To give you a concrete baseline, the SR-71 Blackbird, the fastest reconnaissance aircraft in history, flew at Mach 3.2. The Zircon is nearly 3 times faster. In absolute terms, Mach 8 corresponds to roughly 9,500 kilometers per hour. Mach 9 reaches 10,800. Its operational range is approximately 1,000 kilometers. But pure speed isn't the only problem. The Zircon's altitude profile is what makes the intercept geometry particularly difficult. The missile cruises at high altitude, where air resistance is lower and speed can be efficiently maintained. In its terminal phase, the final approach to the target, it executes a steep dive to a low altitude. This drastically compresses the reaction time for surface-based defenses. And then there is the phenomenon of the plasma sheath. At any speed above Mach 5, an object moving through the atmosphere generates enough heat to ionize the air around itself. This ionized gas forms a layer that envelops the missile, the plasma sheath. And here is the property that changes the defense calculus. The plasma sheath absorbs and scatters radio waves. In practical terms, this means that the Zircon's radar return is degraded by the very physical phenomenon its speed creates. The missile that is trying to kill your ship is also, partially, rendering itself invisible to the radar trying to track it. It's not stealth in the conventional sense. The Zircon doesn't have the geometry designed to minimize its radar cross-section like an F-22. The plasma sheath is a byproduct of physics, not a design feature. But the practical effect is very real. Tracking signal quality is degraded exactly when you need it most, during the high-speed approach phase. And there's one more component: terminal maneuverability. The Zircon doesn't fly in a straight line to its target. In the final phase of its approach, it executes evasive maneuvers. This isn't an optional add-on, it's a core design feature. A hypersonic missile that doesn't maneuver in its terminal phase is a predictable target. With maneuvers, it shatters predictive interception solutions. An interceptor needs to be guided not to where the target is, but to where it's going to be. If the target changes direction in the terminal phase, the calculated interception solution becomes invalid. The interceptor needs to recalculate. With a target moving at Mach 9, every second of error means another kilometer of misalignment. Launch platforms, the Zircon can be fired from surface frigates like the Admiral Gorshkov, which carried out the first operational patrol with the Zircon in 2023, and from submarines. Submarine launch capability is strategically significant because it places strike platforms within operational range without the visible signatures of a surface frigate. What separates the Zircon threat from mere speculation is that it is operationally deployed. It's not a development program. It's not a prototype. Since 2023, it's a capability that the Russian Navy has actively put on patrol. The Aegis system isn't the product of negligence or incompetence. It's the result of decades of cutting-edge engineering, precision designed to defeat a specific class of threat, the threat posed by the Soviet Union at the dawn of the Cold War. Aegis was developed in the 1970s and deployed by the U.S. Navy starting in 1983. The problem it was designed to solve was real and urgent. Soviet ballistic missiles, launched from submarines or land-based platforms, approaching American naval fleets on high-arcing trajectories. The heart of the system is the SPY-1 radar, an electronically scanned phased array radar. Instead of a physical antenna rotating mechanically, the SPY-1 uses hundreds of emitting elements that can electronically steer their beam in any direction in fractions of a second. This allows for simultaneous tracking of multiple targets, with refresh rates far faster than mechanical radar. The SPY-1 feeds the Aegis fire control system, which processes tracking data and calculates interception solutions. The interceptors, the Standard Missile, or SM family, are the projectiles the system launches to destroy incoming threats. Here is the crucial distinction. Intercepting a ballistic missile and intercepting a hypersonic cruise missile are fundamentally different problems. A ballistic missile, after its engine burns out, follows a deterministic arcing trajectory. You can calculate exactly where it's going to be with high precision. The SM-3, the primary Aegis ballistic interceptor, was designed for this exact geometry, reaching the missile in its mid-course phase, outside the atmosphere, where it is most predictable and most vulnerable. The SM-3 is an extraordinary interceptor for that mission. But the Zircon is not a ballistic missile. The SM-6 is the Aegis response to advanced aerial threats. It's the fastest interceptor currently integrated into the Aegis system. A top speed of Mach 3.5, or roughly 4,300 kilometers per hour. It can engage targets at significant distances and has terminal area defense capabilities. Against supersonic cruise missiles Mach 2, Mach 2.5, the SM-6 is effective. But against Mach 9, with terminal maneuvers and a plasma sheath, the SM-6 was designed for a different class of threat. The ballistic missile defense (BMD) upgrades that were added to Aegis over the decades improved its capability against ballistic trajectories. Faster processors, improved tracking software, intercommunication with early warning satellites. These upgrades made Aegis better at what it was designed to do. The problem isn't that Aegis hasn't been upgraded. The problem is that Aegis was upgraded to be more effective against ballistic threats, while the threat it now faces is both hypersonic and cruise simultaneously. The core architecture SPY-1 plus SM-6, with the processing latency built into the fire control system, reflects the design premises of the 1970s and 1980s. Those premises weren't wrong for the threat back then. They are simply insufficient for the threat of today. Aegis isn't failing because it was neglected. It's hitting its limits because it was excellent at doing exactly what it was designed to do, and the world moved the targets. The physics of a hypersonic interception can be described with an analogy. Imagine you're trying to hit a bullet with another bullet, but the bullet you're trying to hit is traveling 2.5 times faster than yours, and in the very last fraction of a second before impact, it changes course. This isn't just a poetic metaphor. It's roughly what the SM-6 has to do against the Zircon. Let's talk about closure geometry. When an interceptor chases a target in a tail-chase geometry, the interceptor behind the missile, both moving in the same direction, the closure speed is the difference between their speeds. SM-6 at Mach 3.5, chasing Zircon at Mach 9, a closure speed of Mach 5.5. In this scenario, the interceptor never catches the target within a realistic operational range. The favorable geometry is the head-on approach, the interceptor and the target moving toward each other. In this case, the closure speed is the sum. Mach 3.5 plus Mach 9 equals Mach 12.5. That is fast enough to produce an interception, in theory. But this geometry requires the interceptor to be launched on the correct trajectory before the target is in terminal range. And this is where the Aegis processing time becomes critical. To launch an interceptor in a head-on approach, you need an established tracking solution with enough lead time for the interceptor to reach the interception zone before the target passes by. With the Zircon at Mach 9 covering distance at rates of 2.6 kilometers per second, every single second of processing delay is 2.6 kilometers of lost interception window. The 45-second window is derived directly from these numbers. From the point where the SPY-1 can get a reliable radar return on the Zircon, approximately 100 to 150 kilometers in range, given the plasma sheath degradation, until terminal impact, the flight physics of the Zircon at Mach 8 to 9 compresses the available time to less than a minute. And now introduce terminal maneuverability. Fire control systems base interception solutions on prediction. You track the target, project its future trajectory, and steer the interceptor to where the target is going to be, not where it is. This works for ballistic missiles because their trajectories are mathematically deterministic in the terminal phase. The Zircon changes direction in the terminal phase. When it does, the projected future trajectory is instantly wrong. The fire control system needs to recalculate. The interceptor in flight must receive a new guidance waypoint. With a target at Mach 9, the time between when the maneuver is detected and when a correction can be transmitted and executed represents a distance that can exceed the interceptor's proximity warhead parameters. Think of it as trying to hit a target 10 kilometers away that moves 3 times faster than your projectile, changes direction at the last second, and is partially obscured by interference. That's what the SM-6 is trying to do. The math does not favor the defender, and this isn't a matter of underinvestment or tactical bad luck. It's a direct consequence of the speed ratio between the interceptor and the target, the processing latency built into the fire control system, and the Zircon's terminal maneuverability. 45 seconds is not enough time because physics is non-negotiable. To understand why defense is harder than it looks, you have to look at the problem in layers. Aegis doesn't have one point of failure. It has 3 in sequence, where each failure increases the load on the next layer. When all 3 fail, there is no 4th. Layer 1. Detection. The SPY-1 is a powerful radar, but it has physical limitations that the Zircon's plasma sheath exploits directly. The plasma sheath, the layer of ionized gas that surrounds the missile at speeds above Mach 5, reduces the target's effective radar cross-section. This means the radar return is weaker, harder to distinguish from noise, and harder to establish into a reliable track. There's also the horizon limitation. For a surface radar, the radar horizon is determined by the Earth's curvature and the antenna's altitude. A missile flying at a low altitude in the terminal phase, like the Zircon in its terminal dive, literally stays below the radar horizon until it's relatively close. For a destroyer, this could mean the target is undetectable until it's within 50 to 100 kilometers, depending on flight altitude and atmospheric conditions. Combine harder detection with a shorter horizon, and the reliable tracking window, the time during which the SPY-1 can establish a track solid enough to support an engagement, is compressed. This shrinks the 45-second window before any other variable is even introduced. Layer 2. Tracking. Assume detection is successful. The fire control system now needs to establish a track, a consistent sequence of positions that defines the target's trajectory and allows for the prediction of future positions. For a maneuverable missile, this is harder than for a ballistic one. The tracking system updates based on successive radar readings. With a target at Mach 9, the interval between readings, even measured in hundreds of milliseconds, is enough for the target to move kilometers. And when the target executes a terminal maneuver, the established track instantly becomes invalid. There's also the reliance on external target designation. Aegis can be assisted by external sensors, early warning satellites, patrol aircraft like the P-8, other ships in the task force. But these sensors have their own reaction times and communication latencies. An alert from an early warning satellite provides early notice, but the tracking precision needed for an engagement solution must be developed locally by the SPY-1. The alert says, "Incoming threat from azimuth X." It doesn't provide the intercept solution. Layer 3. Engagement. Assume detection was successful and a track has been established. Now the SM-6 is launched. The SM-6's top speed is Mach 3.5. That's fast, but it's 2.5 times slower than the Zircon. In a head-on approach, the kinetic envelope of the SM-6 is enough to produce an intercept if the tracking solution is accurate and the target doesn't maneuver. With terminal maneuvering and tracking degradation from the plasma sheath, the single-shot probability of intercept drops materially. And then there's the problem of multiple shots. If the first SM-6 fails, is there time for a second? With a zircon covering 2.6 kilometers per second, the gap between recognizing an intercept failure and launching a second interceptor results in several kilometers of lost range. In most realistic engagement geometries within the 45-second window, there is perhaps one shot opportunity, not multiple. What about salvo capability? Launching multiple SM-6s simultaneously increases the probability, but it eats up limited ammo and doesn't solve the fundamental problem that each interceptor is facing the same tracking degradation and the same kinetic mismatch. Each layer adds its own probability of failure to the chain. When these probabilities are multiplied, degraded detection, tracking broken by maneuver, insufficient interceptor kinematics. The probability of a successful single-shot intercept drops to a level that no naval defense planner would consider acceptable. The room has 3 exits. The zircon closes all 3 before you even reach them. The zircon costs an estimated $3 to $7 million per unit. The SM-6, the interceptor Aegis uses to try and stop the zircon, costs roughly $4 million per unit. And the Arleigh Burke-class destroyer carrying those interceptors costs $2.5 billion. The aircraft carrier that destroyer is escorting costs $13 billion. The cost asymmetry in this equation is historic. An Arleigh Burke destroyer carries 90 Mech 41 cells, the vertical launch tubes where the missiles fire from. Not all of these cells are loaded with SM-6s. The ammo loadout is a mix of missile types, balancing anti-submarine, land attack, and missile defense capabilities. In a heavy air defense configuration, maybe 20 to 30 SM-6s are available. Now consider the logic of a saturation attack. If the single-shot intercept probability of the SM-6 against a zircon is 50%, and that's a generous estimate assuming ideal tracking and geometry conditions, then stopping 6 zircons requires around 12 SM-6s. Stopping 10 zircons takes around 20. At that point, the destroyer's magazine is severely depleted, and it's left vulnerable to any subsequent threats. The cost of emptying the destroyer's magazine, $80 to $120 million in SM-6s. The cost of launching the zircons that did it, $30 to $70 million. The attacker spends less to exhaust the defense than the defense costs to operate. And behind that exhausted defense, a $13 billion aircraft carrier. This calculus goes beyond theory. It's the doctrinal logic that both Russia and China have baked into their anti-access and area denial strategies, what defense analysts call A2 Anno Domini. Hypersonic capability isn't just a new weapon. It's an economic lever that flips the attrition equation the U.S. Navy assumed for decades was working in its favor. For decades, the cost of attacking an American task force was prohibitive for most adversaries. Stealth platforms, precision weapons, it all cost more for the attacker than for the defender to absorb or replace. The Zircon and its Chinese equivalents in the DFZF and YJ-21 family flip this equation. The attacker can now exhaust the defender before risking high-value assets. This is a fundamental strategic shift, not a tactical one. There's a pattern that reappears throughout military history with disturbing regularity. It's not incompetence. It's something subtler and more dangerous. The assumption that because a system worked for one threat, it works for the next. The vulnerability the Zircon poses to Aegis isn't without historical precedent. It's actually part of a pattern that shows up repeatedly when defense systems encounter threats they weren't designed for. On December 7, 1941, Pearl Harbor had defenses: radar, anti-aircraft artillery, land-based fighter planes. What Pearl Harbor didn't have was the operational expectation that Japan would attack from a specific direction. with a specific method aerial torpedoes in shallow waters that American naval experts had deemed impossible. The vulnerability wasn't a lack of equipment. It was the assumption that the existing equipment was adequate for any plausible attack. The Maginot Line is often cited as a symbol of obsolete military planning, but the most accurate lesson is quite different. French engineers didn't build the Maginot Line out of incompetence. They built it because it worked perfectly against the type of warfare that World War I had established as the blueprint. Their failure was assuming the next adversary would fight the exact same way. They didn't. Even more directly relevant, the HMS Sheffield during the 1982 Falklands War. The Sheffield was a modern Royal Navy warship equipped with radar and air defense systems. On May 4, 1982, it was struck by an AIM-39 Exocet missile launched from an Argentine Super Étendard aircraft. The missile, flying at a low altitude to evade radar detection, was never intercepted. The Sheffield sank. The critical point here is that the Sheffield wasn't an unprotected ship. It had defense systems, but the Exocet represented a new class of threat low altitude, air-launched supersonic cruise missiles for which the ship's defenses simply weren't optimally configured under those specific tactical circumstances. The lesson of the Sheffield was learned, and it informed decades of naval defense development. But the lesson is always learned after the threat materializes, never before. The pattern is incredibly consistent. A defense system is deemed adequate based on its performance against known threats. Then, a new class of threat appears. The gap between projected capability and actual capability is exposed by a catastrophic event or recognized far too late through analysis. A response eventually follows, but it takes time. The Aegis system is no exception to this pattern. It's simply the next chapter. The assumption that Aegis is adequate for aircraft carrier defense is structurally identical to the assumption that Pearl Harbor's defenses were adequate for any plausible attack, or that the Maginot Line made a German invasion impossible. The premise isn't malicious, it's just the natural byproduct of a system designed for a specific threat, being applied to a world where that threat has fundamentally changed. The good news: the Pentagon is fully aware of the problem. The much harder issue is the massive difference between knowing a gap exists and actually closing it. The U.S. Glide Phase Interceptor Program, or GPI, is America's most directly relevant answer to the hypersonic threat. The GPI is specifically designed to engage hypersonic glide vehicles and hypersonic missiles during their cruise phase long before they enter the far more difficult-to-intercept terminal phase. The real issue is the timeline. The GPI is not operationally deployed. As of 2025, the program remains in active development. The timeline for its actual operational deployment stretches into the latter half of this decade, meaning the glaring gap between what Russia deployed in 2023 and what the US can deploy to counter it is measured in years, not months. Directed energy programs, specifically point defense lasers, are also in development. Conceptually, a laser is an interceptor with light-speed engagement and a cost per shot that is drastically lower than an SM-6 missile. When defending against hypersonic missiles, where reaction time is the absolute critical limiting factor, the instantaneous engagement of a laser would be completely transformative. But laser systems at the massive power levels required to physically destroy a hypersonic missile under operational sea conditions, with all the heat dissipation, sheer power demands, and mechanical ruggedness required for a harsh naval environment, are simply not currently deployed on any surface combat platforms. On a doctrinal level, the U.S. Navy and the Department of Defense have absolutely adapted to the stark reality of adversarial hypersonic capabilities. The 2022 National Defense Strategy specifically identified hypersonic threats as a high-priority defense challenge. Operationally, This translates into planning for significantly increased standoff distances, operating carrier strike groups well beyond the effective range of enemy platforms, and drastically reducing the forward presence of aircraft carriers in highly contested access zones. In practice, however, this doesn't actually solve the vulnerability. It is merely acknowledging a profound limitation. Moving a carrier strike group entirely out of the range of the Zircon ultimately means moving it completely out of the effective range of its own carrier-borne aircraft for many crucial targets. The very power projection that the aircraft carrier exists to provide is severely crippled by the urgent need to protect the carrier itself. The deliberate dispersion of surface groups, creating much wider spacing between escort destroyers to force an attacker to direct multiple weapons at multiple targets, is another tactical adaptation. But this still doesn't solve the saturation equation. It merely spreads it out. What having no current solution actually means for operational planning is chillingly concrete. American carrier strike groups simply cannot operate within the range of a Zircon launched from Russian or Chinese platforms without facing an unresolved risk of absolute catastrophic loss. This isn't a scenario of marginal loss or tolerable damage. We are talking about a $13 billion asset and 5,000 sailors. What that 45-second window truly means isn't just a grim technical statistic. It is a definitive statement about exactly where American naval power can and absolutely cannot go. The central premise of all post-World War II American power projection is the carrier strike group. An American supercarrier and its escorts represent the unparalleled ability to position combat air power in any ocean at any given moment, without ever relying on access to land bases. For 8 decades, this exact capability has shaped global geopolitics. Wars were deterred, crises were stabilized, and critical operations were conducted simply because America could always show up. The Zircon and Chinese equivalents like the YJ-21 don't destroy this capability directly. They create practical exclusion zones regions where the cost of operating an aircraft carrier is elevated above the threshold of acceptable risk by actuarial insurance considerations that no military planner can ignore. The geographical implication is concrete. China claims sovereignty over the South China Sea. If China deploys hypersonic strike platforms in the region, and it is developing the capabilities to do so, the Pentagon's ability to conduct freedom of navigation operations with carrier strike groups within that range faces a risk equation different from what existed 10 years ago. The same argument applies to NATO's northern flank, where Russia has deployed the Admiral Gorshkov and Zircon-compatible platforms. The Arctic and the North Atlantic, historically operational ground for the U.S. Navy, now include zones where hypersonic access denial is a doctrinally credible possibility. This is what the 45-second problem really means. The main issue isn't just about winning or losing a specific naval battle. It's about whether the strategic power projection architecture that America has built over 80 years remains viable in zones where adversaries have deployed hypersonic capabilities. Physics doesn't care about the defense budget. Mach 3.5 doesn't catch Mach 9, regardless of how much it cost to build the missile. And 45 seconds isn't enough time to execute the sequence that interception demands, not with currently deployed hardware, not with a tracking and fire control architecture built for a different threat paradigm. Aegis is a remarkable system. It was extraordinarily effective against the threats it was designed for. The problem isn't Aegis. The problem is that the world Aegis was designed to defend against is no longer the world it operates in. The 3M-22 Zircon isn't the end of American naval power, but it represents the dawn of an era where the assumptions about where aircraft carriers can safely operate must be revised, not out of ideological choice, but as a direct mathematical consequence. 45 seconds. Physics set the deadline. Engineering hasn't delivered the answer yet. If this video changed how you think about naval defense and hypersonic technology, share it with someone who should understand what's happening in this arms race. And if you want to keep following analyses that go beyond what the news covers, subscribe. There is much more to come.